I'm here in Glenelg, South Australia, with this diving chamber. Now, this diving chamber was built by Geo Surveys for the geologist Reg Sprigg. Well, the White Ox just recently completed a Simpson Desert expedition following the Madigan line. Stand by for the upcoming film on that one. So what, you might ask, does the Simpson Desert and a diving chamber have in common? Well, the answer, of course, is Reg Sprigg was a well-known geologist in the area, and he was the first person to cross the Simpson Desert by vehicle. I recently, while travelling through Arkaroola, I had the great honour to be able to sit down with his son, Doug. The resulting interview covered many interesting topics, some of which are the stuff of Aussie outback legend. Well, speaking of Aussie outback legends, I have one with me right now.
Oh God, where is he?
Mr. Doug Sprigg, thank you very much for having me here, and thanks for the interview.
Well, you probably won't thank me for it down the track, but it's lovely to be with you.
Well, anyway, tell us a little bit about this incredible place and how it came to be.
Okay, well, Arkaroola is at the north end of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, so it's in arid lands country. The Flinders Ranges stretch further south and go into temperate climate, but we're at the arid lands end of it. We've got sand dune deserts about 70 or 80 kilometres to the east of us, the Strzelecki Desert, and salt lakes around the place, but we're in the hills.
I imagine overseeing the running of a place like this is a full-time occupation, a labour of love, no doubt. What's a typical day in the life of Doug Sprigg like?
Well, I stay away from the management, so that's all right. Vicky, my other half, does the managing, because I don't have management skills, so I know that, so I can stay away from it.
Yeah.
But I'm a diesel mechanic by training and a commercial pilot, but that gets me outside more than inside, and then at night it's doing astronomy. My time spent doing some of the scenic flights and also a bit of mechanical work, some of the ground tours that we do, and astronomy at night. But I definitely stay away from management.
Yeah. Well, they do say behind every great man is an even greater woman.
Absolutely.
Arkaroola and the Flinders Ranges in general is something of a geological wonderland. Can you tell us a bit about why?
Yeah, the Flinders Ranges are mainly sedimentary geology. So about 900 million years ago, the supercontinent Rodinia was centred on the equator, and we're part of that. And we had Canada and North America just out that way, a short distance.
Yeah.
And we didn't have hills, so you could walk across the flat into Canada and North America. Travel was cheap, and we didn't have Canberra. It should have been called Utopia. That continent pulled apart, and that pulling apart started about 900 million years ago. And when the continents pull apart, you open up a rift valley, the sea moves into the rift, and then seabeds start being laid down. And we also had lava infilling between the continents, and we've got that just on the eastern edge of Arkaroola. So the rest of the Flinders Ranges south of Arkaroola record the geological history of sedimentation, laying down of those seabeds, which went on for 400 million years. And we had a couple of ice ages during that time, so the Sturtian Ice Age, the first ice age in the Earth's history. We had icebergs floating around near the equator and releasing rock as they melted in this area. So in the southeastern portion of Arkaroola, we've got some of that glacial tillite, the remains of debris from glaciation, then a massive global warming. Then we went into another ice age, which was recorded in other parts of the Flinders further south, and then another global warming, and so it went. But Arkaroola is the older bit. It's the deep crustal stuff that's been uplifted and exposed mainly. So Arkaroola is quite different. We'll come to that later.
Yeah. Well, as one of two children to the legendary geologist Reg Sprigg, can you tell us what life was like growing up for you?
Exceptionally good fun. But I didn't grow up. I just got older. And, that was I think it was almost a conscious decision I made many years ago.
Yeah.
The Peter Pan syndrome.
Yeah.
But my dad he was across so many different sciences, and he made science really interesting.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were lots of other fun things besides the science, but I think he had these passions for science that were they permeate others, or you're infected by them.
Yeah.
And then he'd give you some of the tools you need to do the science. So even things like mathematics, it gives you something you want to work out a problem, and then it gives you the mathematics to work it out. So you get other subjects that are tools for that, but really good fun.
Yeah, it sounds like a great environment to be learning.
Yeah, well, I think trying to do everything in the classroom is a challenge, and I take my hat off to teachers, and I'd never want to be one, but we have a program up here to try and get kids out of the classroom doing sciences for that reason, and we can get a pretty good conversion rate, converting 25% of them from arts to sciences when they've already decided they're going to stream with arts. Nothing wrong with arts for those people that are artistic, but it should be the artistic that take up those challenges, not others wanting an easy way through school and ending up with little to work with later.
Yeah, indeed. Well, you have many interests and hobbies, and I believe one of those is flying.
Yeah, I do love flying, but I really I think it's something that you share, because otherwise it's a capitalist self-indulgence. So I love being out with other people, and looking at the geology from there was something that I got from Dad. I'm not a geologist. I find certain parts of geology exceedingly confusing.
Yeah, right.
But seeing things from the air, you can put the geology together.
Yeah.
It's so much better than you can just from the ground.
Yeah.
So it was one of the tools.
Was
that
that
Dad
something
used.
your father did a fair bit of?
A lot. Yeah. So Dad was. I had Rudy Brunschweiler bring out a little aircraft, a Sokol from Austria.
Yeah.
And they used that to go looking for oil and gas in the Cuban Basin.
Yeah.
And I might tell you more, but CASA don't need to know. Actually, it's probably gone past the time limit.
Yeah, probably time limitation.
Yeah.
Your father was a student of the great Sir Douglas Mawson, a mentor and teacher to perhaps some of the best scientists ever to come out of Australia. Mawson described Reg as probably his best ever student. He had a few other descriptions as well.
Yeah.
Do you remember much about Mawson?
Well, unfortunately, I don't remember meeting him. I was about 3 at the time, so I wasn't paying attention. My sister remembered Mawson, and she took rocks to him. Might have been about 5, but
Okay.
I still wasn't paying attention. But Dad and Mawson had a pretty special relationship. Dad was looking after Mawson's mineral collection as a curator of it when he was at high school, and Dad used to argue in science with Mawson. And I know that other people were sort of in fear and trembling of Mawson to some extent, but Mawson loved the challenges in science, and so I think Dad might have been way off course with some of it, but the fact that he was willing to put himself up to be knocked over, Mawson loved that.
Yeah, would have earned him a lot of respect. I think Mawson was pretty hard on himself as much as he was others.
His time in the Antarctic and just surviving it, but that overshadows the science he did down there, going to the South Magnetic Pole and everything else geologically with it.
I think sometimes that's true. We're getting onto that. Actually, Madigan questioned his character a lot after Antarctica, but it does, as you say, we forget about the actual science and the brilliance there. But the next question was actually, the White Ox, as you may or may not be aware, is currently producing a film about the Simpson Desert, and in particular Cecil Madigan. Madigan was also a protege of Mawson, although their relationship broke down as a result of the Antarctic expedition. What do you recall of Madigan?
Well, I never met him. I've met his offspring, an amazing family. But Cecil T. Madigan, apparently, from what Dad said, came back from the Antarctic, saying that the Antarctic wasn't big enough for the two of them. But the reality was they spent 6 months in a hut together, which is probably a bit much for the two big egos.
Yeah.
And while Madigan was second in charge of the geology department at Adelaide Uni, the second in charge was very much subordinate to the head of a faculty at that time. And so Madigan decided he was going to put his efforts into the desert. Yeah. And he got funding from the Simpson family, of Simpson Pope washing machine fame.
That's a nice little tidbit. I just found that out.
Yeah,
the Simpson Desert is the same Simpson as those fantastic washing machines.
Yeah. And they were amazing philanthropists and still are. That goes on in the Simpson family. But Madigan changed, the name of the Arunta Desert to that of the Simpson, the Arunta tribe that were out there, but he named it in their honour. And for his work in the Simpson, and in scientific endeavour with his camel trek across the desert, he got Madigan Golf named after him in the Lake Eyre, southeastern portion of Lake Eyre, because of his contribution to science, which I reckon's wonderful.
Yeah, it is indeed. He seems like a very fantastic bloke, Madigan. We're big fans at the White Ox.
Yeah.
Well, at one stage there, Reg was firmly in the sights of ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Agency. Reg was, as you know, probably the most knowledgeable of all geologists when it came to the wonders of Flinders and also uranium deposits. During the Second World War, he came to work two large deposits, those being Radium Hill and Mount Painter. He was not to know it at the time, but the uranium was intended for the development of atomic weapons. This meant that deposits like this were of huge strategic and military value. Do you think that also made him a target for ASIO, and how do you think he felt about this?
Yeah, well, Dad didn't know much about ASIO. He knew that there was interest from them at one stage, but he was followed around for 10 years, from certainly about 1942 to 52, and ASIO said he was the most knowledgeable person on uranium geology in Australia, and therefore a threat to the national interest. Which is sort of a bit like shooting yourself in the foot, I guess. But
either a threat or an asset, depending on. I suppose they still got to keep tabs on you one way or the other.
Yeah. Anyway, that curtailed Dad's involvement in uranium almost certainly in 1952 or thereabouts, and then he went looking for oil and gas.
Yeah. So despite being the most knowledgeable uranium geologist in Australia, and as a result of the ASIO file and his continual dissatisfaction with the South Australian Department of Mines, Reg Sprigg went looking for oil and gas. Ben Dickinson, the Deputy Government Geologist in the South Australian Mines Department, as well as his predecessor Ike Ward, were steadfast in their view that the search for oil and gas was a waste of the department's time and resources. On the subject of Australia's oil and gas potential, the esteemed American petroleum geologist Frank Reeves, in a paper to the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, had this to say: "The failure to find oil in an area as large as the United States cannot be attributed to a lack of technical ability. It is evidently due to the absence of certain geological features necessary for the accumulation of oil. Australia has no commercial oil fields, and because of unfavourable geological conditions, will never produce enough oil to supply its own domestic needs." Reg wasn't so sure. Here's a quote actually from Reg's diary when he, upon discovering what the purposes of Mount Painter and Radium Hill search for uranium was intended for, he wrote, "The utilisation of energy released from the splitting of the atom opens up a completely new epoch in human history. It is obvious that what was only recently regarded as fantastic has now become possible and inevitable. Man, in this new conquest of his environment, enters a period in which possibilities of human advancement exist side by side with the gravest and most terrible threats to all civilization." From his personal diary. Anyway, I found that quite interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on now. Reg's work, among countless other achievements, was the discovery here in the Flinders of some very important fossil records. So significant were they, in fact, that it led to the classification of a whole new geological time period, the Ediacaran. The first new period added in over 120 years, pre-Cambrian. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, it was the only one that's got a gold spike in the southern hemisphere, so that's rather lovely too. Dad was specifically looking for soft-bodied animals because he was of the opinion that before we got exoskeletons and skeletons, we had soft-bodied animals that got around, and they should have been left in the fossil record until you got the development of scavengers or predators, and then you'd lose that soft-bodied animal record.
Yeah.
And he found them in the Ediacaran Hills, just on the western side of the range, a little south of Lee Creek. And Mawson wasn't happy with his discovery.
Yeah.
But through Dad's the the specimens out, and also ridiculed him at a talk he gave.
Yeah, publicly, I believe.
Yeah, but Dad took that as Mawson wanting to protect Dad from much greater and wider ridicule by the scientific community. Sir Edwith David had suffered that on a similar sort of thing, but it turned out that Dad was right. And eventually they named one fossil, which is now the South Australian emblem, fossil emblem, Spriggina, little fossil about so long that has bilateral symmetry, so the two sides of it are similar like we have, and a head end. So while it was, Dad reckons it was probably the lowest worm that ever lived, it was the brightest thing around at the time because it had a head end and was starting to build up sensory organs at one end of it, because if you're going in one direction, you don't really want to know what's going out the back. You're more interested in what you're running into. So then you have to maybe develop a brain to process the information.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that this was a sort of a missing link species?
It seems to be, and I think there's more work being done on it, much more, to see if there is a tie-up with the Cambrian that came after, because this is in the pre-Cambrian, 530 million years ago. I mean, the period I think goes back to 560 million years, and that's after the end of the Maranoan Ice Age, that second Ice Age. So coming out of that, the warming possibly had something to do with, probably had a lot to do with getting energy levels up to the point where you can go from simple life to more complex life, and then plant life jumping to animal and asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction. All those things seem to come along, and then we don't notice it again until we get to the Cambrian. But there's people doing work on that right now, so we're living in an interesting time, and I just wish Dad were around to see it, because he'd be rapt.
Yeah, he would. Yeah, well, I suppose for people who aren't aware, the Cambrian period, geologically speaking, is known for the explosion of life, complex life forms, is probably its most...
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, here's another topic that I'd love to ask you about. In 1962, I'm pretty sure I have the year right, your father, your mother, your sister and yourself embarked on what was to become the very first vehicle crossing of the Simpson Desert. Tell us what you remember of that, and could you describe the route you took?
Well, I had a ball on it. I just because as a 7-year-old, it's just a great adventure. It's not, and don't have all the worries. Leave that to the parents. And people say to me still, "Oh, I can't believe your parents took you to the Simpson Desert," and I sort of think, I can't believe they brought me back. But that's more their thing. But just had a ball. So heading out across the desert from west to east, and I remember going to Andade Station, and
you did go that way.
So a bit north of the French line.
Because I often thought you might have taken the French, which probably wasn't even around.
No, it wasn't. That was built later, but we were a bit north for most of the trip, and met up with other vehicles going across the desert. So there were 2 Toyotas in the desert. We had a Nissan Patrol.
Yeah, you did.
And that was just really good fun. But going over each individual sand clump with spinifex grass, Tradia grass, holding it together, the torment on the vehicle was amazing. And one 44-gallon drum or 200-litre drum of water in the back, and one with petrol, and so the 4 of us across the front seat. My view was, the Nissan Patrol had these vents just below the windshield, so my view of the world was out through there, not through the windshield above. And I was fascinated by Dad's stereoscopic pair photogrammetry images of the Simpson, because he could tell where he was from the sand dunes. So it was sort of a rudimentary mapping exercise for me. But when he was taken off uranium exploration, he went and mapped the state photogrammetrically from aircraft with stereoscopic pair images. And we've actually got the camera that was used for that down in visitor centre down there. Anyway, so that was all great fun, and meeting up with the others halfway across the desert, and then continuing to Birdsville via Pepple's Corner. And But I mean, the amazing things, that you had Coulson that went across the desert by camel by himself. Just amazing. And then, they chained the desert to work out the boundaries, of the state, and got it pretty accurate. The chain links were wearing, so it actually extended a bit. But we found Pebbles Corner Post, and that was repatriated to the South Australian Museum, the Adelaide Museum, and going through Mum's diaries of the trip when we did a reenactment of the journey across the desert following the French line, which was much easier. But Marg and I, my sister and I, ran out of things to argue about halfway through the first day, so it was going to be pretty boring. And so she started reading Mum's diaries, and that was really good because we did a few trips to the Simpson, but that sort of set in concrete my memories of that first trip. Great fun.
I mean, just compared to today, your family's going across with their air-conditioned luxury four-wheel drives and their camper trailers and their refrigerators. And what was the intended purpose? Was this part of his quest? Because he knew about, back in those days, the oil and gas fields, or the potential for oil out there in the Cooper Basin.
That's right. Yeah, so the Cooper Basin had already been discovered, and it didn't get going properly until about 1972. The gas line went down to Adelaide, and then Adelaide got away from coal gas to run the power station and supply power, gas to Adelaide for domestic purpose and everything else. But in 1962, Dad was looking for larger areas for oil and gas possibility. And one way of doing that is to do gravity surveys. So you look at the gravitational pull of the Earth, and where you've got hard rock that's coming up toward the surface, you get a higher gravitational pull. It's a very minor change, but measuring that, you can find the gravity highs, and then you go back and do seismic, where you send a shockwave down through the ground, hits hard rock layers below, comes back to the surface, and the transit time gives you the depth of the hard rock layer. And if you can find dome structures, oil and gas can be trapped under them. So that was the purpose, the primary purpose of that trip across the desert.
Amazing. Well, that leads me on to the next question. Reg's work in oil and gas led to the eventual formation of Santos, the South Australian Northern Territory oil search, among other companies, a very successful company and a big player in the market today. What do you think Reg would make of where the company is today and the direction it is headed?
Yeah, I think he'd be pretty happy. I reckon Dad would have been really keen to go to make the jump to a renewable or a natural energy, which is geothermal heat. And I think we get there probably within the next 20 to 50 years, but Dad didn't mind those sort of time frames, he was a big picture person. So Beach Energy, the company that Dad started after Santos, because Dad had a reasonable shareholding in Santos, and they were looking for oil and gas down around Wilkatana, just north of Port Augusta, and that didn't have the potential for oil and gas that Dad thought was possible with the Cooper Basin. So Dad had flown over the Cooper Basin area, particularly in the Menka area and just a bit north of there, where he could see anticline structures poking out of the ground, and dome structures. They don't often poke out of the ground because as the sediments come up, they stretch and break as they're pulling apart, and so you get these jump up hills. But if you fill in the bit between every hill, these mesas, these flat top hills, which are land surface, actually curve, if you fill in the bit, and that's the top of a dome structure. Anyway, so Dad was convinced that area would have oil and gas, and he got Delhi Petroleum in from the United States as a farming company, because Santos had used all their money up on the work down around Wilkatana near Port Augusta. And when they struck gas up in the Cooper Basin, then it changed the dynamics of South Australia. Interestingly, back in the time when Dad was looking for uranium in the Mount Painter region, it was Mawson that actually was mining radium as early as 1911, after coming back from working with Madame Curie in France, and suggested this area should have radioactive minerals. Anyway,
Mawson had played a hand in the discovery of radium from samples sent to him by a pastoralist and amateur prospector by the name of William Greenwood. The samples were dismissed by the School of Mines as being of no real significance, so Greenwood sought a second opinion. Mawson. at the Adelaide Geological Department. He correctly determined the ore to contain element number 88, radium, using techniques he had learned while working with Marie Curie in France.
Mawson was mining radium because in the early days they weren't interested in uranium. Uranium was a waste byproduct, which wasn't very radioactive, where they wanted the very radioactive radium. But then later they realised they could fission the uranium and make bombs or power generation. Anyway, so the work was focused in the hills here and also at Radium Hill later. But another product of Mawson was Richard Grenville Thomas, mineralogist and geochemist, and he said to Dad, that the uranium would be out on the plains in good quantities, not in the hills, and nobody believed him, Dad included. Anyway, it turned out that he was right, and it was proved 30 years later, and that's Beverley Uranium Mine that we've got just east of us, where they don't have to dig the ore out of the ground, they just circulate water with hydrogen peroxide in the water. I use it for hair colouring, they use it to get the uranium out of the ground. And so very simple and benign process to extract uranium. But Dad was always at pains to give Thomas the credit for understanding the geological systems there, the hydrology, better than others. And we had 4 generations of the Thomas family up here recently, and I was saying that to them, and they said, there's another side to that. Our grandfather told your dad not to go looking for oil and gas in Australia because there wouldn't be any. So they said it's sort of one all. And this was Mawson country, and in fact, if it hadn't been for Mawson really instilling in Dad the worth of this land scientifically and ecologically, because Mawson was the one that noted that there hadn't been any pine trees regenerate for about 30 or 40 years, and it went for 70 years and no regeneration of pines or mulga. And Dad went to the government. Dad promised Mawson he'd go to the government and try to get it being a national park. When the government wasn't interested in starting a national park, eventually somebody in government circles in 1967 said, if you feel so strongly about it, do it yourself. So Dad bought the lease. And I think Mum found out about 3 months later, but she was happy with that. The bank balance showed her that something had been bought, and it's gone on from there. And we've got a national park right next door to us, and they do really good things now. So it's sort of a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. It's probably worth mentioning just Marie Curie. She is fascinating. She actually discovered uranium. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Also, the first
radioactivity
female Nobel Prize winner, the only female to win 2 Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
Quite a remarkable character, and a friend of Mawson's, or they were acquaintances.
Yeah.
Well, I will leave you with a final quote. I've taken this out of Kristen's wonderful book. I hope she won't mind.
I don't think she will.
But Reg was Australia's quixotic geologist, more visionary than Douglas Mawson, more entrepreneurial than Cecil Madigan, more successful than Edgeworth David. An oil field is named after him, as well as a fossil worm, a radioactive mineral, an asteroid, a scholarship for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander undergraduate students, a prize for Australia's best oil or gas crusader, and a coastal inlet on the northeast tip of Kangaroo Island. So not bad for a life's work, I suppose.
Yeah. Beautiful.
But, that was really enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
I really appreciate that. And I've got some gold there, so it's fantastic.